in progress.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, Angie. Hi, everyone.
Howdy.
Hey, hey. Oh, hi, Bailey. Super glad you could be here. Thanks for doing this. Hey, Lori, do you want to share your screen today or do you want me to do it?
I am a terrible screen sharer. It's something you should know about me.
You all know
I'm
that
really
Lori has been officially helping us now and has helped me prepare for this meeting, which is why you're starting to hear her on the emails. But I just need to get these slides up.
I should have warned you.
It's okay.
I can take notes though.
Talk amongst yourselves for just a minute. We'll let some other people come through.
If you want to co-host me, I'll be happy to let people in.
Yep. I didn't hear from Shasta, but I imagine she's coming also. Everybody's feeling in no camera mode today.
I'm saving bandwidth because my wife's like giving a presentation to Forest Service.
What does your wife do?
She works on post-fire hydrology in Cal. She works for California Geological Survey.
Aren't you guys a cute pair? You're like me and my husband, and then we just kind of talk about work
all the time.
All the time. It's not good for sleep. All right.
Work or cats.
All right, I think I've got it ready. Okay, y'all can see this, right?
Yes.
Well, yeah, welcome back. This is the 25th meeting. Can you believe it? We have a good session, I think, for you today. As you guys know, we've been meeting every other month. Some of us met last month because we wanted to do some coordination around what's going on in California and some research, kind of aligned, adjacent research. But this is our bi-monthly meeting. As always, we're here to exchange knowledge on tribal adaptation and knowledge, tribal adaptation and resilience data needs. We focus a lot on data access. We sometimes share tools, practices, ideas, lessons learned from the field, and we're always looking to explore opportunities to develop or scale up solutions that can address these tribal resilience data gaps that we know exist. And so today we're going to do our normal kind of intro. If you have announcements for each other, we'll spend a little time there. For now, in the chat, if you could put your name, organization, and location. And sometimes what I like to do is see if anybody is brand new here and invite them to introduce themselves. Brett, have you been to these meetings before?
About a year ago, I attended, and then somehow I must have fallen off the list or something. And then I said, after I spoke with Lori Carey Cathera, who was on your list, it's like, wait, that's right, I got to get back on this. So I'm just for anyone I haven't met, I'm Brett Folger. I'm a regional geospatial coordinator with NOAA's Office for Coastal Management, and I cover California, Oregon, and Washington. So good to be here again.
Thank you, Brett. And Brett is going to come and speak to us at our next meeting, it sounds like. And a lot of your work is around, is including data sovereignty, right?
Yeah, we do a fair amount of public data hosting for things like LiDAR and hyperspectral imagery and other remote sensing data. And so we're trying to understand how to be better stewards of data sovereignty with those data. And also we're a big grants shop. So we send a lot of money out, and we're changing our processes right now to basically to allow for indigenous knowledge and other information that tribes don't want to be shared publicly even though it was part of their grant
Hmm.
to remain with them. But I'll share a little bit more about that later, as well as some questions we're trying to figure out.
Great. Yeah. Super glad you're joining us. Who else is new? Is there anybody else who this is their first meeting? No. All right. Well, then why don't we go ahead and go into our member announcements. As usual, we like to have a little open space here just to share any relevant information for your fellow members of our work group. So it might look like, you got this project you're working on, or there's some opportunity out there, or you learned something at a conference. So is there anybody who'd like to start and has anything going on that they would like to share? I know you all have a million things going on. I can tell you all that we at Prosper Sustainably, so that's my firm, and we're the lead consultant on Tribal Climate Health Project. We just got awarded a contract with the Strategic Growth Council to be the tribal capacity builder, building TA support. So there's a grant that went out to 6 tribes in California to build capacity, and we are going to be able to provide TA support for them. Very in line with a lot of the stuff that we're already doing through the Tribal Climate Health Project. All right, everybody's being shy today. Well, if you think of some announcement, something new or different that we all should know about, let us know. You can throw it in the chat also. Asamu's got a new haircut, so that's one thing. But we do have a speaker today. And so I wanted to introduce her. She's going to present on a new tool that's coming out of CARB along with Eagle Rock Analytics. So Bailey Smith, I'm super happy that you have come to be with us here today. And I want to just hand it off to you. And if you need access to co-hosting, and you probably have screen share, then we'll go ahead and provide access for you.
Thanks. I'm actually going to have one of my staff, Stephen, who's the contract manager for this work, share his screen. So if we get him screen share, he can share a presentation. So I'm with California Air Resources Board, and I'm here to talk. Well, I'm going to let our contractors talk about a tool we're developing. So I work on California Climate Investments, which is a incentive program that funds 80 different types of projects through a bunch of different agencies. So we have a very wide range of things we fund. We wanted to develop a resource for agencies to understand how to best choose projects and understand how projects that have already been funded are helping address climate risk and adaptation. So Stephen developed this scope of work to do a contract to create a composite index for climate risk. And we contracted with Eagle Rock Analytics, who is going to develop that tool. And I will let them talk about it. For the interest of internet connectivity, we have pre-recorded a short presentation that we will play for you, and then open up for any questions you have about how we intend to use the tool, or its development, or how we are, weighting certain aspects. So with that intro, I will hand it over to Stephen to share the video and also the audio associated with video.
Yeah, hi everybody. I see we've got some Eagle Rock staff here. So I have your recording. We can play that because it was crisp, and that's cool. We weren't sure if we'd be able to have everybody here. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. It's about a 15-minute presentation, and then we'll have time for Q&A live with the developers. So that's pretty cool. Let's see. So you should be able to see. Yep, there we go. I think that's all set. And I will just hit play and sit back and relax and enjoy the show here.
Stephen, are you hearing audio on your end?
Yeah, are you?
We are not.
Okay,
I think
one
that's
second.
always a problem with Zoom.
Yeah, it's all different now. Let me see. All the buttons moved. Sharing and share sound. Oh, there we go. There's an extra button to click. You should now be able to hear it. So I'll just step back to the beginning and start us over.
Hi everyone, my name is Victoria Ford and I'm the lead of development for a climate risk and adaptation index for the state of California. This work is in collaboration with the Air Resources Board and I'm really excited to show you what we've been up to when building this index. So the motivation behind this work is to more specifically quantify the benefits of California climate investment projects throughout the state. Since 2014, California has invested something over $10 billion addressing and preparing the state for climate change. And so the intent behind this index is that an evaluation of risk from climate change and climate change impacts really requires an understanding of the state's increasing vulnerability to climate change. Because the increasing frequency of extreme climate-related emergencies is increasing, it really does present a very uniquely disruptive challenge for all California residents. So ultimately, with the creation of this index, we really want to ensure that all decisions regarding data, methods, and approach are transparent for all to ensure that it is fair, understandable, and accessible across users, communities, and agencies. The index that we're building, so the California Climate Risk and Adaptation Index, which I'll call CalCRAE, it updates an existing method that was run at the nationwide level, and this is from the EPA. What we are doing is ensuring that all development is specifically designed and focused on California. So the previous EPA method was run at the county level. What we've done is actually worked to incorporate data at the census tract level, and this is primarily to ensure that we are better capturing local impacts and efforts, and so that way we can focus really on what's going on at the regional level. All of the development code that we're building for this index is going to be transparent and accessible in a single open source code repository. And along the same lines, all input data is also going to be accessible in a very well-documented single location. And what we've done is we're also accompanying all data with very clear metadata text files. So that way all transformations that have occurred to the data to make sure that it's appropriate for this risk index is also available and accessible to all. And this data has been vetted for this project in particular. So diving into how the CalCRAE is structured, there are 4 main domains or sort of groups of information that are designed to capture as many different multidimensional aspects of risk across California. And so these 4 groups are governance, built environment, natural systems, and society and economy. If you wanted to consider the index or CalCRAE as a house, these 4 domains would represent rooms within that house. These rooms are related, but you wouldn't want to consider the information tied to a kitchen in the same boat as, say, a living room. Each domain is comprised of indicators, and each indicator has input data metrics. And so if we wanted to look at the built environment consists of 4 indicators, including transportation infrastructure, communication infrastructure, utilities infrastructure, and housing vacancy and quality. And I've listed the different data metrics that go into each of these indicators. If we wanted to return to our house analogy, an indicator would be a piece of furniture within a room, and a data metric would be the materials that went into building that piece of furniture. And so in total, we have 26 indicators across these domains, and that comprises 122 data metrics. So we have intentionally designed this index to be as multidimensional and to incorporate as many aspects of data that are appropriate for California as we can. Now, these 4 domains are then used to evaluate the risk of climate events occurring, of which we consider wildfire, extreme heat, drought, inland flooding, and sea level rise. And for each of these, we consider both the exposure to that event as well as the losses that have historically occurred from such events. So in this next slide, I'm actually showing the more technical side of things, and we'll work through this equation together. But this is how the CalCRE is structured. And so what you'll notice is that we have our 4 domains in the top portion, and that governance appears quite prominently. And then we have society and economy, the built environment, as well as the natural systems. You'll notice that there are these little I's, and that just means that each I is run at the census tract level for a specific census tract. And so for the value of the CalCRE, which is looking to measure resilience across the state, we look at the census tract level and it's run for all census tracts. Each of the domains is then adjusted for the median score across all of California. And that's really designed just to ensure that we're capturing as much local regional information as we can for a particular census tract. And then the last piece that you'll notice is that there are these weighting factors, so A, B, and C. And so this is where we're able to weight each domain for relative importance for a particular risk. And I'll show what that means in the next portion of these slides. But effectively, we can consider all of these data sources, all of these domains equally contributing to how we can evaluate risk across the state. Or we can also incorporate slightly different numbers to be able to weight certain domains higher or lower based off of how folks are responding to and need information based off of a particular risk. So now I'll actually jump into the index itself. And so here, this is a Jupyter notebook. This is how we've actually coded the index itself. And so what we have here is we're using synthetic dummy data that we've calculated just to be able to show how the index works. So our team is currently in the process of actually calculating all 122 data metrics. So that way we're making sure that all data is as appropriate for California as we can. But we wanted to make sure that we could demonstrate the utility of the index and what kinds of information that we can glean from now together. And that way we can continue developing this to be able to provide as much information and as much benefit as possible for folks. So in this demo, what I'll show is how the CalCRE is calculated with this synthetic data. We'll play around with different weighting scenarios and see how that adjusts the values. And we'll be able to visualize what that looks like across California. So in this first step, all I'm doing is importing a few Python libraries and a few key really useful functions. And this is just to help speed up quite a bit of the work. And this is designed for you as well. In this next step, we're actually retrieving that synthetic data. And this is for every single census tract. Here, I'm just displaying the first 5 rows. So we have each census tract. We have values for each of the domains. You'll notice that they are standardized, and this is just to ensure that we can compare each domain equally. And this is sort of just a very broad overview of what is going on. We have calculated the median value across the state per domain, as well as that adjusted value. Again, these are synthetic, so randomly generated numbers, but just wanted to be able to show all the steps that goes into this method. And then we do the same approach for the climate domain. So that way we're able to actually build and calculate the CalCRE resilience score value. So this equation should look really familiar. And so here in this step, we are going to first weight those domains. In this example, we'll start with an equal weighting scenario. So this would be sort of the standard baseline approach to understand how each domain really compares to one another. And then we actually calculate the index with this really handy function. And all that's here is this function right here is programmed into this function to be able to calculate it. This runs really quickly, so in this instance, it ran in less than a second. So this is highly computable and highly customizable and would be able to get you information in a really quick manner. So one of the things that we would be able to provide is some summary statistics. And so we try to provide as much context as possible. So a minimum value here, for example, would be a negative value. If you see a negative value, this just means that it is less resilience. A positive value or a high value would mean more resilience. And so in this synthetic data set, what we're seeing is that the mean and median across the state indicates more resilience. And ultimately, our goal is to be able to compare the index to CCI projects to evaluate their efficacy for communities. So if we wanted to see, therefore, okay, what produced some really high values, one of the next steps towards analysis is going to be figuring out which conditions led to really high values, because that could be a really useful piece of information for folks as they're designing future CCI programs that they want to apply for, or other sorts of analysis information that could be of use to you. And so here we're just demonstrating, okay, which census tracts had a really, really high value. But again, we're going to be looking into, okay, what were the conditions that led to those high values and be able to provide that to you. So in our next step, we'll actually visualize that equal weighting scenario. And so here again, each of those domains had a value of 1. And so we have a handy plotting function, and this is what the CalCRE with the synthetic data looks like across the state of California. So again, positive values, so any census tract that has a color of blue is a positive, more resilient census tract. And then any location that has a negative or these yellows, oranges, and reds is a less resilient location. And so an important thing here to note is we can dive into the individual domains themselves to see what led to that particular value for a specific location. And so in this next step, we're looking at the individual domains that went into that calculation. So this is just the same map as it was above, but now we've provided what the inputs per domain looked like. And you can see based off of various locations that in some domains, it provided a more resilient weight, and others it provided a less resilient weight. And so we want to be able to provide as much information to help you as possible make planning decisions, data decisions, and be able to provide as much context as we can for your local and regional planning needs. So again, this was for the equal weighting scenario. In our next step, we can actually demonstrate the power of our custom weighting scenarios. And so here I've just built out a hypothetical scenario for wildfire. And so here I've set the individual domains to a different value. So for example, with wildfire, we could say, okay, the built environment is really important with things like above ground power lines. The natural environment is going to be really, really critical for wildfire as well. So we've changed these weights and we have recalculated this. Again, this value right here, 4 milliseconds, says how long it took to run this piece of code. So it's really, really quick. And that could be a really strong benefit for folks needing to run their own custom scenarios. And so if we wanted to look at what this looks like for a wildfire scenario, this is a recalculated map. We can tell that across the state, there's quite a different mix between positive and negative values, just again, indicating more or less resilience. And we can then look at the individual domains to see, okay, really what was going on at each level and be able to really refine this a little bit further. And so if we wanted to look at a different hypothetical scenario, so for example, if we wanted to look at sea level rise, we could say society, let's set it to 1.5. We'll take the built environment back to a 1, for example, and let's set the natural systems domain to 3 and see what happens. And so we'll rerun, and then we'll set this to sea level rise, and we'll visualize what that looks like across the state. And so here we have another hypothetical change to a scenario. And so this is really just designed to show how customizable this index can be for your needs. And so once we've replaced the synthetic data with the actual data, it'll provide much stronger results towards what we can provide for you. And so ultimately what we're looking for in terms of our next steps is that we want to make sure that the CalCRE is useful for your needs. And so what would be really critical for us to know is what kinds of customizations would be really helpful for you in using this information. What weighting scenarios are you interested in and could be responsive to your needs? And what kinds of outputs from this tool would actually be a real benefit when applying for funding opportunities? Thank you.
Okay, well, there you have it. And we have the developers here on the call with us. Hi, Owen, Victoria, Jesse. I think that's everybody. So ask them all the difficult questions because that ain't my job.
Well, yeah, we really appreciate that presentation. Live coding in real time, pretty cool. Let me ask one question before I turn over to you, Lori. Okay, so it sounds like the audience for this tool are applicants to CCI. Is that right? And is that the only use case that you're considering?
Definitely not the only use case we're considering. This purview of our program is California climate investment, so that was kind of the way that it I would say was designed, but we designed it with hope that it could be useful to wider folks, either people who are agencies is one, the agencies that are developing these programs, applicants that are looking for applications, but any like local government who wants to plan, any like, you know, tribes are a great example of how they could use this for, you know, their area. We are hopeful and are eager to hear of other users so that we can make it work for them. Because there's a lot of great data to be used here. We don't want it to be limited to California climate investments, if that makes sense.
Lori.
I wonder if you looked at some of the problems that CalEnviroScreen had as far as using census tract data and how that applied to tribes or left tribes out when you designed this. And if so, how are you working around that so that tribes can actually use this and aren't caught flat-footed like they were with CalEnviroScreen?
Yes, so that is an excellent question. So when we were designing the CalCRE, like thinking in terms of the kinds of data inputs that are going to be involved, so across those 122 metrics, the inputs were a variety of different like spatial scales. And so what we're intending to do with, as we build this out even further, is that where as possible, where tribes are indicated in the actual input data themselves, we are retaining that information as clearly and as explicitly as possible. And so in the data itself that is going into the CalCRE calculation, it's indicated, and in the metadata as well, where we have listed every single transformation that has occurred on the data. Where tribes are specifically listed, we make sure to retain that information just so that way it's really, really transparent from the data aspect. The census tract issue is a very tricky one, especially for some of our data layers. We're looking at geospatial data, and so reducing to a certain point, you know, the resolution of the data can only go so far in terms of capturing information, especially at fine resolutions, thinking about census tracts. One thing that we are thinking about and exploring is that there is also the tribal census tracts where, so instead of like the quote unquote standard census tracts, we also have the data for the tribal census tracts. So in addition to the notebook that was just displayed in the slides, we are also thinking of being able to provide a version where folks can really narrow in on their region of particular interest. And so being able to clearly identify tribal regions so that way folks can really dive into their locale and region and be able to pick out that kind of information. Moving forward from there, I think that's where we want to be particularly, really careful with how we move forward in terms of that. And we wanted to make sure that in both the data selection, so thinking about the layers that go into CalEnviroScreen, as well as the data sources that we sourced that were as appropriate and as detailed as we could possibly make it to be, but there is that limitation in terms of quantification of particular aspects in a very multi-dimensional view. And so this is something that we are continually thinking about, and the census tract piece is sort of the next big bucket of work that we're thinking in terms of building out that data repository. And so please.
Was this a long answer for they're left out for now, but they're planned to be included later? I didn't understand. Sorry.
Oh,
because I know the CalEnviroScreen leaves many tribes out.
Yes. So in terms of what we're doing, it is in the works. And so we want to just make sure that it is as sensitive as possible, and moving forward from there and being able to provide as much information as possible, and being able to really dive into feedback that we can incorporate as much as we can. Does that help answer that question?
Yeah, this comes up.
Sorry, I was asking a follow-up question to Lori about I am familiar with, I think, some of the issues with CalEnviroScreen and how the census data itself by census tract does not include a lot of information from tribes, but it would be helpful to better understand what those gaps are and how those struggles are so that we can avoid them or find other data sources.
It's not just that it doesn't include it. They're often too big. I'll give you an example. Bishop Paiute tribe is in the Owens Valley. If you look at that area on CalEnviroScreen, it looks great. Low unemployment, it's a fabulous place. If you look at what the tribe is experiencing, since it's smaller than a census tract, it's not good. So when they go to apply for grants, they can't justify getting a grant because they look too good in CalEnviroScreen. And what I see is that happening again, because many of the tribes are in rural location, which is about 10 miles in a census tract. So depending on where you are, I'm in Mendocino County, where I am is not the Mendocino that people come and visit. But in a census tract we look great. So, Potter Valley tribe has a hard time applying for grants and getting grants because they look too good.
Thinking boundaries it has come up with every single tool we've talked about in our 25 meetings, and it's really challenging. I've worked with tribes where you have them, they're in two separate census tracts, right? So their boundaries just bleed into more than one, and that's difficult too. So you're in one and another, neither of them are really right. And then some systems can scale down all the way down to the tribal scale, but then you lose, right? You have to scrub and you lose a lot of the data because it's too small. There's privacy issues. It's a real problem. And then on top of that, the tribal boundaries are sort of up to interpretation sometimes anyways, or are changing. And so it's hard. It's a hard one. Okay, Isabel.
Yeah, thanks. Hope I remember. Lower my hand. Okay. I had some of the same questions related to the tribes, and I'm wondering whether this is a follow-on, this wasn't my actual question, is maybe it needs to be rejiggered to where those populations actually are. Like when you normally spatially weight for something, maybe that needs to be taken into where actually do the tribal residents live? And that's the model that they would have. The other thing I was wondering, and it goes to my sort of, I think I've missed a couple bits from the presentation, I apologize, but is the different rooms, when you see those in the output maps, is that the risk from or the risk to?
That is a great question. So each individual domain, so the rooms are all they're all considered in like connection to one another. And so the what we're trying to really build with this index is that you're not isolating for one particular risk, because that doesn't happen in reality. And so thinking about how we can weight particular risks higher for folks if that is a more pressing need. But that way we're not sort of isolating for one particular risk and ignoring the other aspects. And just thinking about how, you know, these things are very climate events can happen in concert with one another. And it doesn't mean that, okay, we're only going to consider wildfire, so our risk to extreme heat is just not a thing. They very often like interact and interplay with one another. And so considering them all together. And so each room or domain does work for every single risk that we would want to look at and be able to provide information for. And so it's not necessarily a single risk for a single room or domain for a single risk. It's how each room actually plays for all risks and how we actually want to focus on a risk or a kind of risk and weight them as appropriate for sort of a different kind of scenario.
And it's risk
that-
today. I'm sorry.
That's
Go
not
ahead,
my
Bill.
question. I don't think that's what that really that you're maybe more technically answering the thing that I am missing. I'm talking when you look at the map and you go to present it to your public health officer or someone who's doing it, and you see, okay, this map of San Diego, this tract is red under in the society grouping, but it's blue in the natural. Is that coloration referring to the risk to that room that might be higher and lower to a different segment? Or is it that's the one that's driving the problem?
So
That's what I'm trying. It's more the interpretation. What are we saying when we look at those maps?
absolutely. So in this example, so if a particular census tract is red or has a negative value, that would ultimately mean for that particular domain or room is that it has less of a weighting score that gets built into the final index value itself. And so for the same census tract in a different domain, if it's a positive value, that means it contributes positively to the overall weighting scheme. And so it's the balance and the averaging of those, you know, a negative score in one domain and a positive or a blue value in a different domain, and how that results in a value that combines both of those together. And so the interpretation is what we really want to make sure that we can communicate well. And so why we're providing the individual domain or room scores. So that way, if it's a particular census tract has a really funky value, we want to be able to say, oh, it's because in the natural systems domain, based off of the indicators that we have, we've been able to determine that some indicators provided, you know, a really strong resilience weighting where others did not, and just be able to show that the individual components going into it led to a particular score. And that's why the interpretation is this particular fashion.
Okay.
So Isabel's with the County of San Diego's Health Department, and she runs all sorts of tools, and a lot of the folks in this room do that. I'm thinking about Healthy Places Index and how good they are at communicating what their color-coded map means. And I think you might have some work to do on communicating it, defining it, so that we all know what it is. Brett.
Yeah, thanks. Great presentation. Always fun to hear yourself talk for 15 minutes, right? A couple questions. So is there okay, first of all, the simple one. So like when you showed the sea level rise example, there was a tract basically I think out around east of Bakersfield that had a less resilient score. And would that just mean that that tract itself is less resilient to everything if it's, you know, not on the coast but has some sort of resilience issue to sea level rise?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So with that synthetic data, so what we showed in those maps again is just sort of like dummy random data.
Oh.
So once we have our real data in, we
Right.
do anticipate seeing like actual spatial patterns in terms of particular risks. So certainly in sea level rise, a sea level rise weighted scenario, in terms of thinking very much more inland, it's going to look dramatically different for where it's actually going to matter along the coastline. And so that's just, it was poorly represented.
Yeah,
in
I forgot
data.
about the dummy data. Right. Very good point. Okay, so other question is, I know with these like national or even state scale tools, this census tract level is, it's both, you know, it's a huge issue for tribes who are trying to use the data, but obviously, you know, it's also an issue for people who are trying to create something on a state level that then captures local level information. Because, like, you know, what's the alternative to using census tracts? They're sort of the smallest unit area we have to use. So are there ways to build in, you know, since that's the smallest we can get to spatially, is there ways to build into the data like I guess information that would help represent that tribes exist there or something like that? Like it doesn't necessarily have to be spatial, but in this census tract, say there's tribal populations of this percentage, or I know there's not a perfect way to do it. I'm just sort of spitballing here, but have you considered ways to build that, like, and I'm sure there are ways in your indicators that maybe that's already considered?
So excellent question. I think there's two paths what I want to be able to address that. And so it's the data that goes in as well as what we can build out as the final data product. So where a tribe is indicated in the actual raw input data, we keep that all the way through. And it's we make sure that it's very clearly labeled in the individual data layer. And so when the CalCRE is made available to the public, every single individual data layer is also going to be available. So for folks who want to look up a particular data instance of like what was going on with that data, I really want to look at it. It is going to be available. In terms of being able to think about sort of the spatial distribution of the state as a whole and be able to provide tribal information, especially location-wise. So we have downloaded the tribal census tracts, but what we can do is thinking about a different kind of data layer. That way we can pull location and tie that into the final sort of index map itself. And so one of our notebooks that we want to develop is a more regional, like telescoping view for particular areas. And so that can be certainly something that we build in to make sure that for folks who are looking to pull information for a tribe's area, is that it's like, okay, this is, you know, based off of the boundary that we could pull is where a tribe could be able to pull that information, and diving back into that spatial issue in terms of this is as high granularity as we can get with our data at present.
That's a good.
So does that mean, can I just clarify that? Does that mean, so it would still be at a census tract, but you would tell us how many tribal people live there? Is that what we're saying? Because that's not useful for tribes. That might be useful for a county who wants to serve tribes and understand how many tribal people there are to serve. But for the tribe who only has control over its own lands and wants to figure out what they can do and what their risks are, that higher scale. We use it all the time because it's usually the best we can do. Like sometimes we'll use county scale data because it's better than nothing, but it's not what they need. Sorry, Brett, continue.
I'm just responding to that. That is absolutely really useful for us to know, because we certainly don't want any sort of misrepresentation of the data that goes in. And so that's something that we can absolutely look into incorporating, so that way it is as appropriate as it can be.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think this is just a challenge that is worth bringing up every time. How do we, even just in, say, a census tract that has a huge wealth gap, but like if it's averaged out, it can still look very good, right? That's the kind of stuff that I think, as you said, Lori, makes it harder for even harder for those groups, say, in that census tract that are facing adversity in some way or another, usually financial or service provision, things like that. Makes it even more difficult for them to basically use these tools to get more funding and more help. So, I just think that's a great place for to brainstorm and what a solution looks like. I think from folks like you, Lori and Angie, because it might have to be something more qualitative that makes that's harder to bring into these sorts of tools, but is necessary. So just a great little conversation. Thanks.
And in Justice 40's map and CalEnviroscreen, like at the end of the day, they just said all tribal, at least federally recognized tribal boundaries, those are considered for us disadvantaged, right? And so I don't know what that means or translates to CCI, but it might mean there's like an additional weighted handicap or something, like something to say that there is likely to be greater risk to tribes. Okay, sorry. Colleen.
Yeah, hi. I'm Colleen Bodenreiter. I'm with the Public Health Alliance, and we developed the Healthy Places Index, which is used kind of similar to CalEnviroscreen in some cases. I was wondering, is the Jupyter Notebook, is that going to be the main way for people to use the tool, or are you going to develop a maybe more sophisticated like visualization platform and ways for people to interact with it?
That's a great question. So as a part of this work, we wanted to make sure that all of our methods were very transparent and could be run by another, data analyst, anyone who is interested. So those are going to be available, but the main output of this index is actually going to be like a geodatabase. And so we're building this in partnership with CARB, so that way it's going to be publicly available on a website, so you can like zoom in, you can like download information. So that's the intent. So more almost along the lines of like a GIS data layer.
Yes.
Oh, also add to that the contract with Eagle Rock is to develop the methods and develop the tool. And one thing that CARB may do is take this and then make it a more usable, like user-friendly tool for specific audiences. And that may involve like setting the weighting based on what we understand to be something that's agreed upon. So we may take this and change it based on feedback we get from this process. And that would be I think a more like public-facing tool. I have one follow-up question on the census tract data being really difficult to use when it's really large. Have similar scale issues with census block data? Is the data just not there at that level, or do you find like it's easier to work with?
Bailey, is
Lori,
this
you're
for me?
It's hard to find the data down to the census block.
Yeah.
And then you run into privacy issues, right? It's going to have to be scrubbed out.
Too small. Yeah.
Yeah. It's really tricky with tribes. I'll bring up again, which I brought up at other meetings. There's a University of Washington Tribal Impacts Program. I forget the name of it. Tribal Climate Impacts Program. They have a map that they do. They have a tool for tribes to understand their vulnerabilities. And they do it by mapping, and they have a drop down. Basically, like for user friendliness, it would be nice for a tribe to be able to approach a tool, just find themselves. They could drop down, some list and be like, here I am, or search for themselves, and then it populates up. But they figured it out, and not only that, it's this academic process. They went out and found out what the tribes think their boundary is, because that's what really matters. If a tribe is using this as a decision tool of some kind to act, ideally they get to select, right? So it might be their tribal reservation, it might include trust or fee lands, it might include their ancestral boundaries, and that's kind of up to them for what they feel they want to try to influence, protect. And I can send that to you as an example.
That would be very helpful. Thank you.
There were some other questions in the chat, and I just want to invite folks to raise anything that did not get answered. Like Chris, I know you're having some good conversations here in the chat. Do you want to elevate some of that, even what you learned?
Sure, I'm just checking if there's another Chris in the group. Just me. Okay.
Oh, you.
Yeah. So I have two core. Some of those I think have been addressed. I think two new questions are going the opposite direction. Are there considerations for aggregating census tracts or reshaping the concerned areas? I know that can be pretty difficult, but if there's any way to do that within the tool. And then the second question is, have you been talking with folks that are developing the vulnerable communities platform as well, and what you're doing differently or similarly with that?
So to the spatial aggregation question, so not at present. So at present, we are working at census tract as much as we can. Many of our data layers were at the county level. And so that's one thing that we are trying to be really intentional to make sure that, you know, how we're actually going to be taking county level data to census tract level makes sense in reality rather than just like dividing equally, because that's not what happens in reality. And so that's one of the conversations that we're thinking through right now. And so it's very much on our minds, but thinking moving upwards, not at present, but is something that, you know, is very much could be done on an individual basis once we like make the code available and the data layers available for folks. In terms of the vulnerable communities platform, we have had some conversations in that space to be able to understand where we are doing similar work and where we're doing dissimilar work to make sure that we are providing a new benefit and how that translates to the overall like program goals for this particular contract. And I think there's some really interesting work that could be done beyond this work and being able to connect them back together. But is very much in our minds in terms of there are multiple places where similar kinds of information and similar kinds of questions, especially revolving around the spatial scale of data, is very much on our minds.
Thank you.
I've got one more. I'm happy to take anybody else's. Trying to really understand the relationship with the funding and the language around more or less, and like, is it a snapshot? Is the color that comes up today a snapshot of right now? Is it incorporating projections of risk in the future? And is it conditional? Like, does it change based on the funded work? Meaning like this project's supposed to improve our resilience, and so therefore it's a different color or score?
That's a great question. And I think there's actually two paths there. So this wasn't brought up in the presentation. So when we are thinking about risk from like a climate event, one of the novel things that the Eagle Rock team is doing with CARB is thinking about climate change in terms of acute events. So like a wildfire, an extreme heat, like heat wave, but we're also thinking about chronic climate change. So thinking towards how climate change and climate change impacts is going to change in the future and what that could look like in determining that climate risk value. And so we have incorporated climate data projections to be able to capture that information, and thinking about how you define chronic is a tricky question. And so we are providing, we're providing like a a technical memo in terms of the methods that we're employing to do the climate risk domain itself, in terms of, okay, here's the kinds of information that went into building out the statistics of calculating chronic climate change. And then could you remind me what your second question is? I'm completely blanking in the moment.
No, I forget. Oh, does funding impact the resilience level? Like, does the project change that? Is that the function of it?
So one of the next pieces in our work is, once we've built out this data repository, is we are going to be evaluating the current database of CCI projects against the CalCRE to be able to identify projects to that risk value. And so that's why we want to make sure that we are getting feedback in terms of those weighting scenarios, because that will change how those individual projects can be evaluated. And funding is particularly a piece of that. And so we want to make sure that the weighting piece is cognizant of what kinds of information are going in, because if we went with the equal weighting scenario, that's one way to represent that data, especially from a funding and project perspective. But if equal weighting is not what folks are looking for, that's the kind of information we need at sort of the current level that we're at, to make sure that what is produced in our next steps can address those questions.
We'll just add that that's a look back, like that's looking at previously funded projects of what, based on what has been funded and what we know, what's that doing. What we're not doing is saying that by funding a project, you are changing risk, because we don't know that on a project level. And just because we give funding to a project doesn't mean it's going to be successful. So the project funding itself doesn't influence whether or not the risk is there.
Yeah,
So it's considering adaptive capacity already in place. Yeah, I'd be interested in digging more into your index or your indices, your indicators. And if you haven't already seen it, we've got this whole tool of ours where we tried, it's a very similar structure actually. We have 5 main hazards, 3 main impact areas, a lot of different weighting based on what the tribe in our case values, and just hundreds of indicators that we look at, or at least offer to tribes. So that's all open access and you can see it as well.
Yeah, I thought I could drop an example to help try to work through that thought process. So like we have the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Program funded through CCI. I think that's Department of Water Resources, or no, Water Resources Control Board. So for example, if we went through the CCI database, we have like, I think if it's a household water delivery, I think it's like anonymized by the census tract to like, some kind of water procurement project happened at like this specific spot, and we're going to map those on top of like a scenario where we've weighted the drought more heavily than say sea level rise. We'll see, are these going to places? Yeah, thanks, Chris. That is Waterports in the chat. He posted a link to that if you hadn't heard of it yet. So we're going to see, are these safer programs going to spots where drought is a huge problem? And just that's kind of to like almost like a back test for what we're working on. And then in the future, as far as like, using this for demonstrating need for funding or something like that, if it was wildfire prevention grants program, just throw one out there, they would have like instructions instead of the ideal here might be like, instead of asking a landowner to go and do their own GIS analysis and like map out the area that's at most at risk using a map that they may or may not have the technical background to be able to navigate, they would get instructions in the grant application maybe to be like, use the tool, find where you're at, and then, weight the wildfire at 4 or something like that, and then tell us, what's the score. And then it's like, oh yeah, that's a super high risk area according to this multivariate, way of looking at things. And therefore, you don't have to go and make your own map or hire somebody to make your own map. We've already got it for you.
There's one more question here I want to jam in before we close, and that's from Ben. And thank you for that, Stephen. That was super helpful. He says, will there be the ability to break down the singular number into its components? I think, further down than natural, all into the indicators beneath.
So thinking in terms of, okay, here's the score for a particular census tract, being able to look at the indicator level. And so the idea there is in our sort of zoomed in area, we would be able to provide individual indicators to be able to look at how those interplay with one another. Yes.
Oh, and then Lori wants to know how often is background data updated?
So in terms of sourcing our data, what we've done is pull for where it is available. Our data covers 1980 to 2014, and that is static. So at present is not going to be updated from that aspect.
Okay, I'm gonna have to close this out. Feels like we could talk a lot longer. This is really interesting. We so appreciate you coming to us at this stage in the game. If you would like to come back sometime or find yourself wanting more direct input from tribes, you can let us know. We sometimes have access to those things, although it's really sometimes hard to get it out in front of tribes. So we're trying to make that a little bit easier in certain ways. Thanks for everybody coming. We will see you in 2 more months. If you ever have something you want to bring to our work group, just give me an email. Take care.
Thank you so much.
All right, thanks everyone.